Last Friday, after becoming concerned whether my national security apparatus had provided me with a security or a complete factual record with respect to the implementation of my policy toward Iran, I directed the Attorney General to undertake a review of this matter over the weekend and report to me on Monday. And yesterday, Secretary Meese provided me and the White House Chief of Staff with a report on his preliminary findings. And this report led me to conclude that I was not fully informed on the nature of
funds were transferred, and that's one of the things that has disturbed me and disturbed the President. That was not an inherent part of anything having to do with the policy itself. Instead, it was actually an aberration from the policy. And
although not directly involved, Vice Admiral John Poindexter has asked to be relieved of his assignment as Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and to return to another assignment in the Navy. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North has been relieved of his duties on the National Security Council.
We don't know the exact
staff.
amount yet. Our estimate is that it is somewhere between $10 and $30 million. Admiral Poindexter did know that something of this nature was occurring, but he did not look into it further.
Is anyone else going to be let go, sir? Is anyone else going to be let go?
No one was let go. They chose to go.
What about
News media representatives in the White House press room weren't the only people abuzz with questions after those startling announcements by the President and his Attorney General on November 25th, 1986. Anyone interested in national and international affairs had questions as well. Was the Reagan presidency unraveling in a process that would lead to impeachment? What were the implications for the not-so-secret undeclared war against the government of Nicaragua? Would the Middle East grow even more unstable due to United States and Israeli machinations? And, perhaps most intriguing of all, how could experienced politicians with a seemingly strong national mandate have gotten themselves involved in a situation where they were selling arms to a supposedly outlaw state and secretly funding what appeared to be an illegal war which Congress had refused to support? In order to answer these and other questions, half a dozen congressional committees decided to hold hearings on various aspects of the Iran-Contra affair shortly after the announcements by President Reagan and Attorney General Meese. The congressional leadership, under Democratic Party control after the November 1986 elections, decided to consolidate most of those inquiries into a joint panel composed of 11 senators and 15 representatives. They and a large legal staff began private hearings of witnesses early in 1987, and public hearings began on May 5th. For 41 days over a 3-month period, 250 hours of testimony was heard from 29 witnesses. And for all of that testimony, Pacifica Radio was live on the air, gavel to gavel, to bring it to a nationwide audience of community radio station listeners. I'm Larry Bensky, and for all of those hours and all of those witnesses, I was Pacifica's announcer in the Washington hearing room. Like other news media representatives, I had and have lots of questions which the public testimony and the thousands of pages of documents which supplemented it have left unanswered. For that reason, we undertook to produce the following program called Untangling the Web, the Iran-contra Hearings Revisited. We hope you'll follow this broadcast attentively to see if it helps you to understand and put in context these dramatic historical events. A note on the style of this program: aside from these words and a few at the end, there is no narration except to identify people speaking and to ask an occasional question, like this first one, concerning the committee's formation, to one of its members, Senator William Cohen of Maine. The enabling legislation, the authorizing legislation, seems to have been rather narrowly drawn to look at only the two matters of the arms sales to Iran and the diversion of funds to the Contras. And then we saw a further narrowing of time, only looking at 1985 and 1986. Were those staff decisions, political compromises? How did they come to be?
I think they were both political decisions. On the one hand, by drawing the charter fairly narrowly, it was intentionally done in order to accommodate this in the House's institutional needs. It would be not only unseemly, but perhaps even unsupportable for the Senate to have granted a broad charter to the committee that would have preempted the other committees' jurisdictions. Because we had such a small representation on the committee, 11 members, to then have precluded other committees from having the jurisdiction to investigate the subject matter, I think, would have been very controversial in both the Senate and the House. So that was one political decision that was made internally as far as how it affects the relationship of the members in the Senate and the House. The second decision was also, I think, a political judgment, namely to set a reasonably short time objective in order to minimize the charge that would inevitably come from the administration and Republican members of the House and Senate that the Democratic majority was seeking to delay the conclusion of the hearings in order to exploit the president's difficulties. So I think it was a political judgment that we could set a reasonable time frame in which to conduct the investigation, knowing in advance that that would put various pressures on the committee. Nonetheless, the judgment was made, I think correctly so, that to have extended it much beyond that time frame would have indeed been perceived as political exploitation in the name of a committee investigation.
If you look at the composition of the committee on the House side, you will see that there are 5 of us who chair committees here in the Congress that had some jurisdiction over the Iran-contra matter.
Ohio Representative Louis Stokes, chair of the House Intelligence Committee.
And so I really think it was a real stroke of genius on the part of the Speaker to have the idea that what he should do is, rather than to have 5 of us with our committees conducting 5 separate investigations here in the House, for him to constitute one panel and then, of course, include the 5 committee chairmen on that panel, which in the House consisted of 15 members. And in this way, he avoided having any type of a circus atmosphere, and I think it worked out magnificently.
The members who appeared in the Iran-Contra panels were chosen because they were the leaders of Congress. So what you saw, whether it was good or bad, was the best that Congress thinks it has.
Haynes Johnson, Washington Post columnist who covered the Iran-Contra hearings.
It's important to understand what was on display here was the congressional system in the way they would like to be seen, as investigators, as fair interrogators, as guardians of liberties and all those things. So with all of the weaknesses inherent, you start with that point. This was, in their view, the cream of the Congress.
My name is James Ridgway. I'm the Washington correspondent for the Village Voice. These were people essentially who were picked to be members of these special committees who represent the hierarchy of the Congress. In other words, they were, to all intents and purposes, senior members of the committees which have had responsibility in this area since it began. I mean, it's a bit like they're investigating themselves, you know. I mean, what were these people doing all this time? Unless they're blind, deaf, and dumb, they must have been reading the newspapers. I mean, according to the press, I mean, when I say the press, I'm talking about the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, not little teeny-weeny papers buried somewhere. This stuff has been going on in the pages of the newspapers since at least, I guess, 1985, 1984, and North Roll and so on has been described. And I just find it very difficult to believe that they themselves weren't quite abreast of this. I mean, if journalists could be abreast of it, I don't see why they weren't abreast of it.
The structure was really all wrong.
Former Congresswoman Elizabeth Holtzman, who served on the Congressional Committee hearing impeachment charges against Richard Nixon and is now District Attorney of Brooklyn, New York.
That a committee, for example, that was as big as this, composed on the House side, on the Democratic side at least, of just committee chairmen, meant that you had a structure that was unwieldy and might not be able, too many chiefs and not enough Indians, and might not be a committee that would do the kind of hard legwork that would produce the kind of investigation that I would have liked to have seen. In Watergate, in the impeachment inquiry, all the members of the committee had to master the evidence. We listened to the tapes, we read the documents, we had the materials presented to us, and we directed, in the end, the course of that inquiry. We were involved in that kind of decision-making. But when you have too many chiefs and an unwieldy structure, the committee may not have been giving the kind of guidance that is critical to focus the questioning, to focus the tone of the questioning, and to give the kind of backbone to the proceedings that are necessary. Frankly, I would never serve as a counsel for a committee that would conduct an investigation with a time limit. There's just no way I would do it, and I don't see how you could ever conduct a responsible investigation under those circumstances.
These people are hired by the American public, elected by the American public, and paid by the American public to conduct our business for us, and we're trying to find out is what actually happened, and who cares if it takes them 5 years? I could care less. I mean, we want to know the answers. They haven't given us any answers. I mean, what's going to happen as a result of this inquiry is people are now going to speculate on whether these members of Congress are covering their own tracks. That is the inevitable conclusion that people are going to reach because of the shortness, the strangulated nature of the inquiry.
My name is Lee Hamilton. I represent the 9th Congressional District of the state of Indiana. Well, I think you just can't keep these investigations going on forever. And I personally didn't object to the limitation on time. The committees go out of business the end of October in 1987. I think it did put pressure on us to move, which in retrospect I think was okay, and made us move. Now, there are going to be some loose ends, and we're not going to be able to pursue every lead to its conclusion. But one of the things we do will be to recommend that other investigating committees of the Congress complete the work.
As a prosecutor, I could tell you that it would be irresponsible, if not an impeachable offense for a prosecutor, to say, well, I'm going to complete an investigation in 2 weeks or 2 months, and regardless of whether you've gotten the truth or not, or all the facts or not, end it. I mean, I can't think of anything more absurd, and certainly not in an investigation such as the Iran-contra affair, which involved transactions that were international in scope. You had secrecy at the heart of it. Transactions going from country to country, from Iran to Nicaragua, involving Swiss bank accounts and laundering of money and shredding of documents. Really, no self-respecting prosecutor, no self-respecting investigator would ever have set a time limit on an investigation of that kind. Of course, you note that the special prosecutor, of course, has set no time limit because they know better than that.
I feel that by focusing so much on the illegalities of the Secord network, we missed, or the committee missed, an opportunity to look into a sustained 7 years of illegalities connected with the Special Operations section of the Pentagon.
Peter Dale Scott, a fellow at the Center for Development Policy in Washington and co-author of a book about the Iran-Contra affair.
From the very beginning of the Reagan administration, there was an enormous commitment to get the United States back into the kind of clandestine operations and secret wars, which I think by general consensus, both Republicans and Democrats had agreed in the 1970s had done the U.S. no good at all and a lot of harm. The Reagan administration was elected with the support of a lot of fired covert operations, with the commitment to get back into the covert operations business. And they did so to an unprecedented degree in the Pentagon. They built up what they call the Special Operations side of the Pentagon in a very controversial way, up to about 15,000 people or something, far more than there have ever been in the past. And really from almost day one, there have been stories of embezzlements and various kinds of illegalities. I believe that that is part of the story of the Iran-Contra diversion, that this was one more illegality in a list of illegalities going back to 1981.
You had put together an arrangement here whereby you could raise money, in a sense, under the auspices of the government, because there were people connected with the government in one way or another who were, in effect, obtaining these funds, going into your account.
Maryland Democratic Senator Paul Sarbanes addressing General Richard Secord, the committee's opening witness.
You then could carry out activities funded by the enterprise, again with the assistance of the government in one way or another, because you're able to portray yourselves as proceeding within their objectives. And as you've confessed, as you've said earlier, you had a free rein to spend this money. Actually, Hakeem would take your direction on how the money should be spent, would he not?
Yes, sir.
So even though it wasn't in your name, your direction to Hakeem would result in the money being spent for those purposes. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Well, why wasn't this an operation that in many ways would have been superior to being the head of covert operations at the CIA? You would not have had any congressional oversight.
As I have testified, Senator, my government asked me to do these specific projects. They were ad hoc projects, and I was not trying to create my own clandestine services organization.
Well, as you're no doubt aware, you and Thomas Clines and Rafael Quintero and others have been sued in federal court in Florida for a vast array of alleged illegal and corrupt practices beginning as far back as 1960s.
Democratic Representative Jack Brooks of Texas questioning General Secord about the lawsuit filed by the Christic Institute.
Did you know about that?
Of course I know about it.
Well, the allegations include the organization of assassination program funded by the drug kingpin in Laos and laundering of millions of dollars skimmed from sale of military weapons to the Shah of Iran, and they've got the provision of military services to Somoza and laundering Colombian drug money.
Can I comment on this suit? This suit, which was filed in May of last year, is the most outrageous fairy tale anybody's ever read. Nobody, including the Justice Department, credits it at all. It's being dealt with. I can only fight on so many fronts at once. I regard that one as a rather minor threat, which will be tossed out of court shortly.
My name is Sarah Nelson. I'm the executive director of the Christic Institute. We're an interfaith law and policy center in Washington, D.C. We're best known for the Karen Silkwood case and project, which we launched and carried through the Supreme Court to a victory. And we are currently involved in a lawsuit against the leadership of the Contras and the team of people that Oliver North has been working with. We had filed our lawsuit in May of 1986, 6 months before the Hassenfuss plane went down and before the Iran-contra scandal emerged. So we were already well aware of who people like Richard Secord are, their histories, and we had named Secord, General Singlaub, Albert Hakim, Robert Owen, and Adolfo Calero, and a number of other, actually 29 people in our lawsuit, charging them with a violation of a number of laws, including violation of the U.S. Neutrality Act, violation of the racketeering law, violation of the arms export control laws, customs laws, racketeering activities such as drug smuggling and illegal gun running, political assassination programs. And we knew that if the Select Committee really did a thorough investigation, that not only their current activities might emerge, but also some of their previous activities. The guidelines for that committee were very narrow. There was a couple years that they were going to look at, and the smoking gun was defined by Edwin Meese. Edwin Meese, when he announced the fact that there was an Iran-Contra scandal, defined the smoking gun as whether the Iranian weapons sales, whether that money was then diverted to the Contras. And that was the smoking gun.
What is involved is that in the course of the arms transfers, which involved the United States providing the arms to Israel, and Israel in turn transferring the arms, in effect selling the arms to representatives of Iran, certain monies which were received in the transaction between representatives of Israel and representatives of Iran were taken and made available to the forces in Central America which are opposing the Sandinista government there. And incidentally, all of these transactions that I'm referring to took place between January 1986 and the present time.
And the rest of the smoking gun was, did the president know about that? Well, from our point of view, that's a very narrow focus in time frame and also in terms of what the smoking gun is. what we encountered in taking information to the committee, for instance, if we would take them information about the history of Richard Secord and his history of embezzlement in foreign military sales and overcharges in foreign military sales throughout the period of Eatsko in the Middle East, which preceded this more recent incident, they would say, we're not here to deal with the history of these people. We're only here to deal with a couple years of activities.
They got sold a bill of goods.
Scott Armstrong, executive director of the National Security Archive, which published a chronology of the Iran-contra events before the hearings began.
They were sold by the chairman of the Senate committee, Daniel Inouye, and the chief counsel, Arthur Lyman, the notion that by taking the president's statements about the Tower Commission report, that is, the president's denial that he knew of the diversion of funds from Iran to the Contras, and by disproving that single statement, they could essentially convict this administration of the misfeasance and malfeasance of which they thought it was guilty. The fact of the matter is they failed to draw those lines and to connect those dots.
Admiral, you talked about the fact that the president was being beaten around the head and shoulders by the media for sanctioning an arms and for hostage deal, and that this finding seemed to corroborate it, and you therefore destroyed it in order to prevent significant political embarrassment.
Chief Committee Counsel Arthur Lyman questioning former National Security Advisor John Poindexter.
Did you regard one of the responsibilities of the National Security Advisor to protect the president from political embarrassment?
I think that it's always the responsibility of a staff to protect their leader, and certainly in this case where the leader is the commander-in-chief, I feel very strongly that that's one of the roles. And I don't mean that in any sense of covering up, but one has to always put things in the president's perspective, and to make sure that he's not put in a position that can be politically embarrassing.
Do you feel an obligation always to tell the truth to the American people, or sometimes do you feel you may have to mislead, as in that case, saying it's without foundation for a higher diplomatic purpose?
No, there are times in which I think you can't answer because of national security or other people's security. But no, I'm not going to tell falsehoods to the American people, and I'll leave that to others.
You know, the question has been asked, I've seen it in the paper time and time again, did the president know?
Former White House Chief of Staff Donald Regan describing a conversation with the president about the diversion of Iran weapons sale profits to the Contras.
Let me put it this way. This guy I know was an actor, and he was nominated at one time for an Academy Award, but I'd give him an Academy Award if he knew anything about this and watched his reaction to express complete surprise at this news on Monday afternoon, the 24th. He couldn't have known it.
They failed to go open the one door that remained to be explored and gone through, and that's the door to the Oval Office.
Haynes Johnson of the Washington Post.
They didn't really want to do that. They didn't have the heart for it, the stomach for it, the political will for it, and there are reasons for that. Reasons being that Ronald Reagan was in the last phase of his presidency. If you started an impeachment process against him, assuming there was evidence, real evidence that would lead you to an impeachment process, which is a political trial, a political judgment, not a criminal one. By the time you got the impeachment process going, you're really taking it up to the nomination of the next president. And so it was what was the purpose, in other words, for it? And I can understand that. That doesn't absent the responsibility to draw the line, though, it seems to me.
Who is in charge of the private efforts to raise the $14 million?
Committee Counsel Arthur Lyman questioning former National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane.
I didn't know, and I didn't purport to know. I wanted to know, really, if he knew.
Well, if one of your tasks was within the law to keep the Contras going, did it not seem to you that it was appropriate for you to inquire as to who was raising the money?
Well, it would have been, yes.
Did you ask North?
Repeatedly, Colonel North and I had exchanges about who is doing it, are you involved, and so forth.
And what were the responses?
That he believed that there were well-meaning, patriotic Americans that were joined together to donate money and were working with the Contras, but that he wasn't personally party to it.
The next witness questioned by Arthur Lyman was Iranian-American businessman Albert Hakim, Richard Secord's partner in what was called the Enterprise.
You said that you set this account up because, and I quote from yesterday, because you became emotionally very attached to Ali, and you still are, and I really love this man.
Yes, sir.
Is it a fact that you met Colonel North for the first time in the end of February?
Yes, I also testified that I got to learn about him through General Secord prior to that time.
Is it a fact that the first time you met him was the end of February?
Yes.
Is it a fact that you had very little personal contact with him between the time that you met him in Frankfurt in the end of February and the time you set up this account?
You're correct, sir.
So would it be a fair description, to use your term of love, that this was love at first sight?
Did you have any discussion with Mr. Channel that evening?
Yes. After dinner, he came over and indicated that he'd heard that I was willing to make an especially large contribution with the idea of possibly supplying weapons or military equipment of some kind to the Contras. He said that there was a small group of people in the United States that the president relied on to make that kind of contribution, that this was a cause that was very dear to the president's heart. And he thought that perhaps I might be interested in joining this group of people.
New York oil and energy investor William O'Boyle.
He asked me to stay or to come to breakfast the next morning with himself and Colonel North. But he said that if one were to give money up to a certain point, if one were to give approximately $300,000 or more, the president would actually meet with the contributor and thank him personally, spend 15 or so minutes with him on an off-the-record kind of meeting, and thank him for the contribution he was making to the national security.
The instruction from North, as you've testified to it, was to open a military front against Nicaragua, the Sandinista government in the south, from Costa Rica, right?
Yes.
Committee counsel Mark Belnick questioning former ambassador to Costa Rica, Louis Tams.
This instruction came from Oliver North, correct?
Yes. That you're talking about the one on the Southern Front?
The Southern Front, yes, sir. Didn't the instruction coming from North seem a bit odd to you?
Well, not really.
You'll recall that when we spoke, in the absence of the documents, you could not remember the specific documents or the specific changes that you made.
That's right, sir.
Mark Belnick questioning Oliver North's secretary, Fawn Hall.
Did you pay attention to any of those changes when Colonel North handed you the documents and said, here, make these changes?
No, I didn't.
Did you ask Colonel North why he wanted you to make those changes?
No, I didn't.
Did you read the changes that he made?
No, I didn't.
Did you appreciate the significance of the changes that Colonel North was asking you to make to those original System 4 documents?
No, I didn't.
Weren't you curious?
It was a policy of mine not to ask questions and just to follow instructions. I believed in Colonel North and what he was doing. I had no right to question him.
I think Colonel North is a man of immense devotion to the preservation of human life. Now that sounds like a platitude, but it isn't at all.
Former National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane, who was Oliver North's superior when the Iran-contra dealings began.
He's a person of very deep and profound conviction, belief in God, who relies on his conscience, as all of us do, but one that is formed in scholarly pursuit of scriptures and passionate in its extreme energy.
Ollie North, before his troubles, hung out with people like the Concerned Women for America, which is Beverly LaHaye's women's group that lobbies against abortion, for school prayer, for Contra aid, blah, 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 the entire list of far-right issues. That was his world, at least for the lecture circuit.
Barbara Ehrenreich, who wrote about Oliver North for Ms. Magazine.
When I wrote about him, I was most struck by the idea sort of that he'd never really left Vietnam. He was desperate to get to Vietnam. When he was a cadet, he skipped a summer vacation in 1969 so he could get right over and not miss any of the action. Now, I don't think too many people miss a chance to be with their families or whatever for a few months before you might be killed. But he went over, then he came back, he was reassigned. He became terribly bored and depressed. I speculate about the bored, but he had his mental breakdown in a period when he was not in combat, and everything that I've read suggests that he was going crazy because he couldn't be in combat, and he was sitting this out in an office job. And the form that his breakdown took, so far as we know, was to grab a gun and run around naked, threatening to shoot whomever. He had no reason to go on living as he was. He goes back to Vietnam to testify on behalf of a buddy who was being tried for a atrocity against civilians. And voluntarily, North went back to testify as to the good character of his friend. And most amazing to me of all, while he was there, and all he had to do was hang out while this trial is going on, he volunteered for night duty in these special patrols that would just go out and cut throats of enemy soldiers they could find in the jungle. And that was at the point at which some of North's own buddies began to say, this is odd, this is strange behavior. You don't volunteer to do this. I mean, very few people who are now allowed to live more or less as civilians would say, hey, can I come out with you tonight and slit some throats? So this is a soldier who took that defeat in Vietnam very badly. I think that we have had in some emotional way a continuation of the Vietnam War on the part of these veterans, Secord and North and others.
Based on everything you know about Colonel North,
Louis Stokes, Democratic representative from Ohio, questioning Justice Department Attorney Charles Cooper.
as a result of your contact with him, your interview of him, let me ask you this. Would you believe him under oath?
Congressman, I would not, but I personally don't believe an oath in any way enhances the obligation of truthfulness.
And in effect, you're saying you would not believe him, whether he's under oath or not.
I have to regretfully say that. Yes, sir, I have to say that.
I think it is very important for the American people to understand that this is a dangerous world, that we live at risk, and that this nation is at risk in a dangerous world, and that they ought not to be led to believe as a consequence of these hearings that this nation cannot or should not conduct covert operations. By their very nature, covert operations or special activities are a lie.
As people prepared their testimony,
Attorney General Edwin Meese describing behind-the-scenes administration activities during his announcement of the Iran-Contra affair to the news media, November 25th, 1986.
Because this had been done in a rather compartmentalized way, as people prepared their testimony for the Hill on Friday, there were certain things where there appeared to be more facts out there than we had already put together. And it was a matter then of the President requesting me to talk with everyone who had any participation at all, because one agency was doing one thing, another agency was doing another thing. There was very little paperwork. And to determine precisely what all of the facts were, because he wanted to be sure that he had all of the information about anything that may have occurred in the course of this whole situation.
I wouldn't call what Mr. Meese did an investigation under any circumstances.
Elizabeth Holtzman, now Brooklyn District Attorney, formerly a member of the House Judiciary Committee during the Nixon impeachment proceedings.
It was scandalous. I can't imagine Attorney General of the United States going without any staff and without taking any notes to interview the major actors in the events. I'm not saying this is what he had in mind, but certainly if somebody wanted to find out what people, to tell people what other people were saying and allow them to prepare defenses and to scheme to not to disclose the truth, that would be one of the best ways of doing it.
My name is Roger Wilkins, and I'm a senior fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. I'm also a Robinson Professor of History at George Mason University. I have been a journalist, a columnist at the New York Times, an editorial writer at the Washington Post, an editor at the Washington Star, and a long time ago I was an Assistant Attorney General of the United States. The Reagan foreign policy and the Reagan policy generally is basically the policy of 4-year-olds. I happen to have a 4-year-old daughter, and she wants what she wants when she wants it, and it does not matter what she wanted yesterday or this morning. Right now, what she wants is what she wants, and she's going to get it, and logic doesn't have anything to do with it. It's just impulse and demand. It seems to me that's the way these people operated foreign policy. We want what we want now, and the United States of America has the absolute God-given right to try to run and manage and master everything in the world.
We cannot be seen, I believe, in the world today as walking away and leaving failure in our wake. We must be able to demonstrate, not only in Nicaragua, but in Afghanistan and Angola and elsewhere, where freedom fighters have been told, we will support you. We must be able to continue to do so. If we do not, we will be overwhelmed. Ultimately, we will be forced to commit American ground combat troops. This nation cannot abide the communization of Central America. We cannot have Soviet bases on the mainland of this hemisphere.
When you believe those things, then checks and balances, the sovereignty of the people, the responsibility to report to Congress, the idea that public debate informs policy, all that goes out the window.
I am admitting to you that I participated in the preparation of documents for the Congress that were erroneous, misleading, evasive, and wrong. And I did it again here when I appeared before that committee convened in the White House Situation Room. And I make no excuses for what I did. I will tell you now that I am under oath, and I was not then.
We do live in a democracy, don't we?
Committee Counsel John Niels.
We do, sir. Thank God.
In which it is the people, not one Marine lieutenant colonel, that get to decide the important policy decisions for the nation.
The only persons in the United States government that knew precisely about this.
Attorney General Meese, November 25th, 1986.
The only person was Lieutenant Colonel North. There was at least one transaction that we know about in which Israel shipped weapons without any authorization from the United States. There was another transaction of a similar nature, although there was probably knowledge on the part of people in the United States about it. This is one of, there was one transaction in late August or September, and there was another transaction of 85 in November, and in the November transaction, actually those weapons were returned to Israel, it's our understanding. Both of those transactions took place between Israel, and Iran did not involve, at that time, the United States.
I had been told by the Central Intelligence Agency, by Director Casey himself, and by others in the CIA that they believed Mr. Ghorbanifar to be an Israeli intelligence agent. Mr. Ghorbanifar took me into the bathroom, and Mr. Ghorbanifar suggested several incentives to make that February transaction work. And the attractive incentive for me was the one he made, that residuals could flow to support the Nicaraguan resistance. He made it point blank, and he made it, by my understanding, with the full knowledge and acquiescence and support, if not the original idea of the Israeli intelligence services, if not the Israeli government.
From my study of Oliver North,
Peter Dale Scott, Senior Fellow at the Center for Development Policy in Washington and co-author of the Iran-contra Connection, Secret Teams and Covert Operations in the Reagan Era.
He's large in my horizon, and I know more about what he was doing than some of the other people, and I would say that Oliver North was one of the least credible. That is to say, he's very good at telling a story, but if you know the facts look quite different from the story that he was telling.
Wasn't the problem
Arthur Lyman, Chief Committee Counsel,
that the Congress had decided that it did not want the Contras supported, and so you couldn't work with the Congress?
Counsel, if the Congress had decided that nobody in the United States of America should render any support whatsoever to the Nicaraguan democratic resistance, then it should have passed a law saying that. The law that was passed, a part of an appropriations bill, didn't prohibit what we did.
The thing that most preoccupies me right now is the very strong possibility that the present administration is continuing to go what I call northwards without north. That is to say that although the person of Oliver North was much discussed in the hearings, the documents reveal that the kind of things he was doing for 3 or 4 years for the Reagan administration were more or less institutionalized. At the beginning of 1986, there was a National Security Decision Directive number 207 in January 86, which created an office to combat terrorism, which gave the National Security Council the responsibility of appointing someone to coordinate counter-terrorist efforts, which created something called the Operations Subgroup, which brought together CIA and FBI and the military special operations people in order to mount joint operations against terrorists. The most famous thing that they are known for was the attack on Libya in April 1986, where they were trying to assassinate Gaddafi in his tent. But what most Americans don't know is that that same apparatus, the same OSG with all of these concentrated powers, was being used also to target private American citizens in this country who had been blowing the whistle about Contra irregularities. And I'm very concerned that many people think, well, all that happened because of North and ended when North left the government. And my concern is that the person left, but these unconstitutional hyper-concentrations of powers, which really are designed to get around the checks and balances of the American Constitution, that institutionalizing of what North did is still with us.
I get the sense that somehow or another we've tried to create the impression that Oliver North picked up his hat and wandered around Washington and foreign capitals begging for money, and I didn't do that. I didn't have to do it, because others were more willing to put up the money than the Congress, because they saw well what was happening to us in Central America and the devastating consequences of a Contra wipeout and an American walkaway and write-off to what was going to happen to this country and to democracy elsewhere in the world. I didn't have to wander around and beg.
There were other countries in the world and other people in this country who were more willing to help the Nicaraguan resistance survive and cause democracy to prosper in Central America than this body here.
And I looked at this list of nations, and I do not see a single democracy on the list.
Democratic Congressman Ed Jenkins of Georgia.
Except the first one, who gave us no financial help. The first one, who gave us no financial help. And I think it's unfair to the panel, do you not, or to the Congress, to say that nations that are not even democracies themselves have more interest in democracy in Nicaragua than the Congress of the United States?
This is a strange process that you are putting me and others through. Apparently, the President has chosen not to assert his prerogatives, and you have been permitted to make the rules. You call before you the officials of the executive branch. You put them under oath for what must be collectively thousands of hours of testimony. You dissect that testimony to find inconsistencies and declare some to be truthful and others to be liars. You make the rulings as to what is proper and what is not proper. You put the testimony which you think is helpful to your goals up before the people and leave others out. It's sort of like a baseball game in which you are both the player and the umpire.
Now, Colonel North, you've added a great deal to our knowledge about the involvement of a large number of people in these events.
Democratic Representative Jack Brooks of Texas.
Instead of operating within rules and law, we have been supplying lethal weapons to terrorist nations, trading arms for hostages, involving the U.S. government in military activities in direct contravention of the law, diverting public funds into private pockets and secret unofficial activities, selling access to the president for thousands of dollars, dispensing cash and foreign money orders out of a White House safe, accepting gifts and falsifying papers to cover it up, altering and shredding national security documents, lying to the Congress. Now, I believe that the American people understand that democracy cannot survive that kind of abuse.
My name is Martha Honey. I live in Costa Rica, and my husband, Tony Avergan, and I are plaintiffs in a lawsuit that has been brought by the Christic Institute against 29 defendants for basically being involved in a conspiracy to set up a southern front of the war, Nicaragua, out of Costa Rica.
I'd like to get your reaction to a moment in the Iran-contra hearings when Rob Owen was testifying and being questioned by Orrin Hatch.
Mr. Owen, you were in Central America in May of 1984 when a bombing attack was undertaken on the headquarters of then former Contra leader Eden Pastora. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, I was.
I would say that well, why don't you just tell us what happened then? I was down there on a survey for Colonel North. The evening, actually, that it happened, I was in San Jose. Matter of fact, Senator, if I can just say, I've been named in a lawsuit in this case, which is absolutely scurrilous, and there's no truth to it. People have tried to say that it was the CIA that tried to kill Comandante Pastora. That I don't believe is the case at all. I had a meeting that night with John Hull and also with the senior CIA official in that government, or excuse me, in that country. We discussed what was going on, and I just was shocked, as everyone else was, when we learned about 3:30 in the morning when some of the Nicaraguans came to the apartment and talked with us and told us what had happened. John Hull has been accused of masterminding it or being involved in it. That's absolutely scurrilous as well, and I'm saying this under oath. So I think that was very malicious. And we were all somewhat saddened, because any time when reporters and Americans are killed, it's always a sad time. I left the next morning and flew on to Honduras.
Rob Owen's statement for us was one of the most interesting parts of the Iran-contra hearings, and rather than drop the question as drop the issue as unfortunately Orrin Hatch did, we would like to pursue it very much with him. Precisely what sort of survey was he in Costa Rica on behalf of Oliver North? What was he doing huddled in a house in San Jose the night of the La Panca bombing with this senior CIA official and John Hull, who's also a CIA operative? And why was it that they didn't learn about the bombing until 3:30 in the morning? I think, in fact, that Owen really let a bombshell drop when he made this statement during the hearings, because the reality is that really the whole country knew by 8 o'clock that evening about the bombing, including the U.S. Embassy. The U.S. Embassy was being bombarded with phone calls from people inside the country and people outside the country about the bombing. It was live, being reported live on a 24-hour news station. There is no way on earth that the CIA station chief, a senior CIA official, and John Hull would not have known about the bombing until 3:30 in the morning. We're extremely suspicious that Owen's mission there had something to do with the bombing, and this arises not only from this statement, but the fact that we have learned from a lot of other sources that Hull and he were involved, and that it was a CIA operation. Among other things, Owen was working for Oliver North. Right after the bombing, literally within hours of the bombing, the Office of Public Diplomacy, among other U.S. agencies in U.S. government departments, began putting out false stories that the bombing had been done by the Basque separatist organization ETA on behalf of the Sandinistas. The Office of Public Diplomacy was being overseen by Oliver North. It was basically a disinformation office to put out false propaganda in the press. This was one of many false stories they put out, and it was quickly proven that ETA had nothing to do with it. Again, we're wondering what was North's connection with this, why this false story was put out. And in fact, one of the people who was perpetrating this false information was Arturo Cruz Jr., who said in an interview within hours of the bombing that it was done by ETA, and that Linda Frazier, the American woman who died in the bombing, had had close relations with ETA, and in fact had probably carried the bomb, he said, herself to the press conference. Now, all of this looks as if it was being engineered out of Oliver North's office, and we have a lot more questions that we feel must be answered. The other thing I should say is that, in fact, I think the reason that this was brought up in the hearings at all was because we had found in Costa Rica, in the days before Rob Owen was to testify, we had obtained documents from the Costa Rican immigration officials showing Rob Owen's ins and outs of the country, and had found in those documents that indeed he was in Costa Rica at the time of the bombing. And we had passed that information up to some of the more liberal members of the committee, and they had the intention of raising this question. And I think Orrin Hatch simply tried to short-circuit this kind of questioning by basically gratuitously throwing this out to Owen, letting him denounce our lawsuit, and basically give a very lame duck reason for why he was in San Jose.
As the hearings progressed, the American people, a great percentage, an overwhelming percentage of the American people, heard about this whole question of United States support for efforts to overthrow the government of Nicaragua for the first time. But it couldn't have come as a secret to those of you who were living in Costa Rica, to the Costa Rican government, to anybody in that country, that there were efforts going on in that country to conduct military operations against the Sandinistas. What was really going on down there that didn't come out in these hearings?
Yes, I mean, we are convinced from our investigation and from all the information that we've gathered over the years of living in Costa Rica that basically what was set up out of Costa Rica was what might be called sort of unconventional warfare, that you had developed in Honduras the creation of the FDN army, the largest of the Contra armies, which basically has operated as a conventional military force. And that what we've seen in Costa Rica is the flip side of that, the clandestine, secret, dirty tricks operations, basically a CIA, NSC, Oliver North network operating in Costa Rica to try to carry out illegal actions like the terrorist actions, like the La Panca bombing, with the intention of blaming these actions on the Sandinistas and basically providing the rationale for upping the war against Nicaragua, for allowing the U.S. to more directly intervene militarily against Nicaragua. Now, there are a number of these incidences. There are a series of border incidences which both Contra leaders and Costa Rican officials now have identified as really being engineered by the CIA. And their contacts within the Contras, their agents within the Contras. There is the La Panca bombing, and then there was a subsequent plot which was short-circuited, we believe, because we exposed it, to bomb the U.S. Embassy in Costa Rica, the Casa Presidencial, the main government headquarters, and to kill a number of people, including a top U.S. diplomat. All of these plots, the border incidences and the attacks against Costa Rican and U.S. targets, were aimed at having them blamed on the Sandinistas and providing the rationale for direct U.S. military intervention.
If you ask for one revelation that came out of the hearings, that's the most important one and the one that's the most dangerous.
Republican Senator William Cohen of Maine.
That this type of concept was not only a matter of intellectual exercise, but was in the initial stages of its actual operational activity. And so I think that if there's one thing that came out of this is that we can't tolerate as a democratic society the creation of a covert capability that is unsupervised by the elected officials of this country.
Now, Colonel North testified that on November 21st, he assured you that he had gotten rid of all of the memos referring to the diversion, whatever their number.
Democratic Senator George Mitchell of Maine addressing former National Security Advisor John Poindexter.
And you say that you cannot recall any such conversation. You testified at your deposition that you instructed Colonel North not to put anything in writing concerning the diversion. Colonel North denied that you gave him any such instruction, and he further testified that had he received such an instruction from you, he would not have prepared and sent several separate memos. I have 5 in my mind, but whatever number, for briefing the President and obtaining his approval. Colonel North testified that you were aware that the chronologies prepared in November 1986 were false. You have said that you were unaware of any deliberate falsification. Colonel North testified that at the meeting on November 20th, to prepare testimony for Mr. Casey to give to Congress, that you knew, as well as he did, that the testimony was wrong. Colonel North testified that his prof note to McFarland, in which he spoke of your request to him to prepare a memo for the President, referred to the one surviving memo which mentions the diversion. You said that it didn't. Colonel North testified that he told you no later than November 21st that he had destroyed documents. You've said that he didn't. Colonel North testified that he discussed with Mr. Casey, Mr. McFarland, and with you what Mr. Casey originally called and what Mr. North testified as the Fall Guy plan. You've denied any such discussion. Colonel North testified that on November 21st, he asked you whether you had told the President of the diversion, and you said you had not. You cannot recall any such conversation. Now, obviously, human memory is such that different people can and frequently do recall the same events differently, particularly with respect to minor details. But as the number and importance of conflict in testimony increase, so also does the likelihood that someone is not telling the truth.
The notion, watching him testify.
Washington Post columnist Haynes Johnson commenting on John Poindexter's testimony.
A man who had graduated #1 in his Annapolis class, who was supposed to be a brilliant nuclear physicist. Unlike Carter, he really did have a nuclear background. PhD in Russian scholars, and is fabled, known throughout the Navy for his great, almost total recall memory. Just remembers every little detail. And for him then to come into this process and not remember anything, including conversations that were critically vital, was just incredible. Literally in the word incredible. It was not believable.
I have a very dim memory of this memorandum.
Did you brief the president on the initiative that's referred to there?
Well, that's my problem. I think, looking at the package, Mr. Lyman, I can't recall that. I'd be surprised if there weren't, but I frankly, I'm not sure.
Senator, I have tried to recall that conversation on the 5th of December. I can't. I don't remember exactly how the finding was presented to the president or what.
Yes, I have a vague recollection of seeing that at the time.
It seems to me, in the light of the circumstances that we've been over and we both agreed to, the sequence of events, that this was an enormously important meeting with you and Director Casey.
Georgia Democratic Senator Sam Nunn.
And yet you seem to not recall anything about it except that you had sandwiches.
I don't remember that. I don't remember the meeting, Mr. Rodino, and I don't remember the subject. If you've got an exhibit, maybe I can remember it. But again, I don't recall a specific conversation on that. I don't recall, Mr. Rodino, having seen this memorandum. I don't recall the specific conversation.
I found Admiral Poindexter's lack of memory and his selectiveness of his testimony to be almost unique in any major public investigation since the beginning of time.
Scott Armstrong, Executive Director of the National Security Archive.
What was on the public record that he couldn't remember implied that he not only had a horrible memory for some of the most unique events in contemporary American history, but that he apparently hadn't read the newspaper in 3 or 4 years. It was implausible, goes well to the understatement.
This clearly was an important decision, but it was also an implementation of very clear policy. If the president had asked me, I very likely would have told him about it, but he didn't, and I think it's, an important point here is that on this whole issue, the buck stops here with me. I made the decision. I felt that I had the authority to do it. I thought it was a good idea. I was convinced that the president would, in the end, think it was a good idea. But I did not want him to be associated with the decision.
If the view that you have,
Democratic Representative Thomas Foley of Washington,
is that the National Security Council is surrounded by a media that often deliberately distorts and deliberately misreports on the news and events, that the Congress is reflecting attitudes that are in bad faith in the attempt to confront the president's policies, that the normal agencies of government are lacking in enthusiasm and sort of affected by a cancer of bureaucratic unwillingness to take risks. It leaves a very small group of people in the National Security Council to whom you would feel comfortable in sharing your plans and
proposals for presidential action. I find that it would be a little distressing if I were in your position and felt that that was the case, as to how in the future a democratic society can develop the kind of consensus and the president's program can be advanced with respect to the Congress, to the press, to the other agencies of the executive branch of government, if that pessimistic a judgment is made about their intentions and attitudes.
Mr. President, is it possible that two military officers who are trained to obey orders grabbed power, made major foreign policy moves, didn't tell you when you were briefed every day on intelligence, or did they think they were doing your bidding?
Helen, I don't know. I only know that that's why I have said repeatedly that I want to find out, I want to get to the bottom of this and find out all that has happened. And so far, I've told you all that I know, and you know the truth of the matter is, for quite some long time, all that you knew was what I'd told you.
The secret methods you chose to determine and to implement policy were also self-defeating.
Committee co-chairman Lee Hamilton addressing Admiral Poindexter at the close of his testimony.
Both Mr. McFarland and Lieutenant Colonel North have acknowledged to these committees that it would have been better to continue the public debate, to seek Contra funding. Both the Contra resupply effort and the Iran initiative were highly controversial. Decisions were made by only a few people. Many experts in the government were not consulted who should have been. Members of Congress were not informed. Contacts with high officials did not take place. Information was compartmentalized. Decisions were made in secret, and discussion about them was limited. May I suggest to you, sir, that this approach did not and will not work. You cannot gain and sustain the support of the Congress of the United States and the American people for significant foreign policy decisions when they are uninformed. The secret means employed on behalf of the policy undermined its success, and when revealed, in my judgment, contributed to its failure.
It seemed from the approaches of the members of the committee and the members of the committee that I've interviewed since that there's really a consensus in Washington, at least in Congress, at least as represented by these committees, that covert action is now legal, it's authorized, and it's necessary.
Covert action is a sort of like a misnomer in some respects.
Jim Ridgway, Washington editor of The Village Voice.
As everyone knows, I mean, the FBI has been involved as a domestic police force, political police force, since the 30s, since certainly 1941, all right? Been doing stuff. The CIA has been involved in this activity since its formation after the Second World War. And, I mean, running a domestic operations and then covert operations abroad. So you have these two elaborate domestic political police forces, which then also, in the case of the CIA, functions overseas. Now, you have a built-in system. You have these intelligence committees who conduct everything in secret, and they're sometimes in the know, and obviously, as these hearings suggest, sometimes not in the know. And it's a loop. It's an internalized loop. Who knows? Who the hell knows what any of this is about?
When it is being done properly, that is, when it is being done by the agency that is recognized to run covert actions, which is the Central Intelligence Agency, then there is no problem.
Representative Louis Stokes of Ohio, chairman of the House Intelligence Committee.
Because the CIA is monitored by the Intelligence Committee of the House and the Senate, where we have oversight jurisdiction and where we have jurisdiction over their program and their budget. But under Ollie North's operation out of the White House, Congress didn't know anything about that operation, and so we had no supervision over that covert action. We had no control over the funding mechanism for it. And so that was what was wrong here in this case. But there's nothing basically wrong when it is done in accordance with law.
I'm Louis Wolf, co-editor of Covert Action Information Bulletin. The bulletin has been in existence since 1978, It was conceived and founded in order to try and research and document and expose the activities around the world and in the United States of the U.S. intelligence apparatus, including but not exclusively the CIA. Virtually everything that the CIA does around the world is in violation of international law, despite the fact that it's sanctioned by, or much of it at least is sanctioned by laws that are that helped or that set up the CIA in 1947 and subsequent legislation. The reality, of course, is that the CIA operates in a secret and very murky world. The double-dealing nature of CIA activities around the world necessitates lying and deception on a massive scale. I mean, there's no other way that they can carry out their work.
When I was chairman of the Intelligence Committee, we began looking into the role of the CIA in all of this, and we had also done some inquiries with respect to the National Security Council.
Democratic Representative Lee Hamilton of Indiana, co-chair of the Iran-contra committees.
But it appears that we were misled in the course of those investigations, in some instances lied to, and we certainly did not have the whole story, but we had enough of the story to know that a lot more investigating had to be done.
Haynes Johnson, columnist for The Washington Post.
For many years, not just in the Iran arms sale, but way beyond that, members of the intelligence oversight committees in the Congress knew about things that were skirting the line or raised questions that they were illegal, improper, and the rest, and they never really pursued them. And I think that is the really ultimate scandal of the Iran-Contra affair, in that the Congress, which knew about it, those charged to know about it, didn't pursue it. And that still remains that case today.
This is Congressman Jim Corder, 12th Congressional District of New Jersey. Covert activities, I agree, as everybody on that panel, is essential. And also, during those covert activities, you have to deal with elements in society that are unsavory. I suppose, to a degree, it's like being an undercover detective. When you're dealing with a criminal milieu all day long, it's an unusual job. Also, covert activity has to be covert because people's lives are at stake. Espionage and gathering intelligence, it's not something that people like to do, I guess, although there's a certain branch that really find it fascinating. But it is quite different. But that doesn't mean there shouldn't be a code of conduct. That doesn't mean that the Congress should not be informed as to covert activity. That doesn't mean that people who decide beforehand that there'll be a covert activity should not place their findings in writing and testify about it to a small elite group of members of Congress, such as the Intelligence Committee.
Congressional oversight is a double entendre.
Scott Armstrong, former Washington Post reporter, now executive director of the National Security Archive, a private research library in Washington.
That Congress, in its attempt to keep watch over, tends instead to overlook. That the amount of expertise that Congress has, or the ability to bring into focus key events, is minimal. That we must insist that Congress become much more involved, much more accountable themselves before we can ever expect the executive branch to be accountable.
I don't think there's an alternative to having covert actions as a part of our foreign policy options. It should be an option that is available, but also only selectively used.
Republican Senator William Cohen of Maine, ranking minority member of the Senate Intelligence Committee.
Since this entire affair has exploded across the nation in the Globe's headlines, that there has been an attitude of cooperation, complete cooperation on the part of the administration and the CIA under the leadership of Judge Webster and Bob Gates. We have very frequent meetings. We are consulted very closely on one covert operation, almost on a daily and even indeed an hourly basis at one point. We have had a meeting with the President of the United States. They have now agreed to certain guidelines, which I think are not enough, and I've put legislation in to make them even stronger. But nonetheless, I believe that we are aware of all covert actions that are currently underway, and I could be totally mistaken on that, but if I am, it means that people simply cannot be relied upon in government, and that's a conclusion I don't want to reach.
If we were really going to grapple with the problem of covert operations.
Professor Peter Dale Scott of the University of California, Berkeley, co-author of the Iran-contra Connection, Secret Teams and Covert Actions in the Reagan Era.
I think we would have to recognize that the kind, particularly these privatized elements that have been conducting so much of our covert operations and low-intensity conflict recently, that they are linked to past operations, the name of Ed Wilson being an example, that go back not just to the 70s, but really to the 60s, to what the CIA and its Cubans were doing at the Bay of Pigs, because some of those same Cubans were involved in the Contra support operation we've just seen. And I've argued in our book that in terms of the intelligence-drug connection, which I see as a very major social problem in this country, a source of drugs, to me it's no coincidence that when we're involved in Southeast Asia in the 60s and 70s, we have a heroin epidemic in this country, and now that we've been recently involved in Central America, we have a cocaine epidemic, where you give a kind of intelligence immunity to covert operatives going in and out of the country in airplanes. You're just asking to have the kind of inundation with drugs that we have experienced.
Some organizations have put this thesis out to the point of the ridiculous.
Scott Armstrong.
I think that when you look around to find out who the government's going to be dealing with when it goes off the books, who a Bill Casey's likely to want to involve in a plot, you're going to find that the people, this isn't going to be Mr. Rogers or Garfield Goose. It's going to be the Ed Wilsons of the world and the people that are like him that are involved in seamy covert intelligence activities. On the other hand, I see absolutely no evidence that came out of this that those people were in charge of U.S. government policy, which is implicitly what this conspiracy theory says. Therefore, I think that the conspiracy theory does a disservice because it tends to pick out an isolated group of people and say, put these people away, get them off the streets, and the problem's over. I don't think that's the problem. The problem is that this mentality, the mentality of using these types of people, has infiltrated the American government. And so it's the problem from the government looking out that we're left with, not the problem of these outsiders influencing the government.
As we wrote in our book, The Iran-contra Connection, back at the beginning of the year,
Peter Dale Scott.
This was an opportunity to look at the privatized operations of the U.S. intelligence community, centering around figures who in the late 70s were associated with Ed Wilson and what they had done for the Contras or in connection with Contra support, what they had done in connection with setting up the Iran arms deals. And as we predicted, the more important the individual, as far as we were concerned, people like Ted Shackley and Tom Clines, who, from my point of view, were at the very center of the sort of global operation that was going on here, the linchpins to the Iran-Contra connection, are names that were almost never mentioned in the Select Committee hearings. And it's actually no surprise that they were never mentioned, because a man who had worked for Shackley in the agency, a man called Thomas Polgar, was actually chosen to be one of the senior Senate investigators for the Senate Select Committee. And I think he was there for damage control to make sure that his former boss's name was not involved in the investigation.
The implication is that because we had Mr. Polgar on the committee, that somehow he was successful in diverting our attention from the CIA activity.
Senator William Cohen.
Nothing could be further from the truth. The fact is that Mr. Polgar was hired because of his knowledge of how the CIA operates, where to look, where to start picking up the rocks, so to speak, where the bodies might be buried, to put it more bluntly. I think as a result of his participation, we had a much greater understanding of the CIA's activities, and for that matter, without Tom Polgar, we would have been much more in the dark than we were. We did not want to involve the agency unnecessarily in a public proceeding in the absence of rather clear and convincing evidence, to use a legal term, that the agency was actively involved in either the arms shipment or aid to the Nicaraguan Contras.
They were timid in a lot of ways. They were timid in taking on the CIA.
Former Congresswoman Elizabeth Holtzman a member of the House Judiciary Committee during the impeachment hearings of Richard Nixon.
They were timid with respect to the president. They accepted edited diaries from the President of the United States.
I endorsed and cooperated fully with the congressional hearings, supplying over 250,000 pages of White House documents, including parts of my own private diaries.
Now, that's another example of terrible judgment in terms of an investigation. And during the impeachment hearings, President Nixon time after time tried to give us edited transcripts. And in fact, ultimately, one of the grounds for the impeachment was his effort to give us edited transcripts, because those edited transcripts edited out all of the impeachable material, or a lot of it. So maybe it's my own practical experience, but I thought it was another kind of incredible and irresponsible timidity to accept edited documents. The committee didn't even subpoena the Justice Department for documents. They were too timid to ask the Department of Justice under an order to submit documents, and there were documents, to my understanding, that were never received. I mean, and of course, they not only were they unwilling to take on the CIA, they weren't even willing to take on Lieutenant Colonel North. They said to Lieutenant Colonel North, sure, you as a witness can dictate when you want to appear and the circumstances of your appearance. Again, that seemed to me to be irresponsible, timid, and unfortunate.
The people in the Congress are still reacting to Vietnam, reacting to the Iran hostage problem.
Roger Wilkins of the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington.
Nobody wants to appear to want to weaken America. Everybody wants to bask in the memory of American omnipotence after World War II, and to refuse to recognize new power realities, that the United States can no longer do whatever it wants to do anywhere in the world. And to suggest that is to suggest that the emperor has short pants on. And people in Congress are not courageous. They don't want to do that.
We did uncover what I think, in effect, was another secret government, one which was not condoned by our Constitution. It was one which was not condoned by the American people.
Democratic Representative Louis Stokes.
I think the actions of that covert government were totally illegal and unconstitutional. But the fact is, we uncovered it. And having uncovered it, we exposed it to the American people for what it was. There is a special prosecutor who is now continuing to uncover all of the facts, and at some point in time will probably indict people, and eventually people are going to go to jail, I think, as a result of the illegality that took place here. Can we guarantee it will never happen again? No. After Watergate, we thought that would be the last type of crisis we'd have in our government of that sort, where illegality was going on in the White House itself. But it did occur again, and possibly it will occur again in our future. We don't know. I hope it doesn't, but if it does, at least we have a government that's capable of being able to remedy it.
The biggest failing, in my opinion, is that it left the American people, perhaps, with the idea that this problem was a problem that was generated by Oliver North.
Sarah Nelson, Executive Director of the Christic Institute, the organization suing 29 individuals associated with the Iran-contra affair.
That he, perhaps on behalf of Poindexter, pulled an ad hoc group of people together to help supply the Contras, because I think it's clear that President Reagan put out the message he wanted them supplied and equipped no matter what, and that was in defiance of the Boland Amendment. That was in defiance of the Congress. And I think that people might have the impression that Oliver North pulled these guys together to do this, and we have this current problem that we can kind of solve by saying that we don't want it to happen anymore. That's very misleading. This is a very old problem that precedes Oliver North and will continue after Oliver North. These are major players that have been involved in illegal activities for years, and they are going to continue unless we take some very strong action to put them out of business.
The president felt very strongly that we should support the democratic resistance in Central America.
Republican Representative Jim Corder of New Jersey.
That he loathed the Bolin Amendment, which ostensibly made that very difficult. Rather than taking the Bolin Amendment to court, saying it was unconstitutional, rather than saying to the Congress openly and above board that I don't think it applies to the National Security Council, it certainly doesn't apply to me, it applies to those stated agencies and departments and not other ones, and therefore I will do directly these things. I'm going to support the democratic resistance. Rather than doing that, he went underground. He tried to circumvent it, rather than challenging it, rather than taking it on directly. He's had people in his administration that lied to the Congress, which is unexcusable. People that somehow believe that you're under a greater obligation to tell the truth if you're under oath than when you're not, which is ridiculous. But I think the president has stood above it. He's not a perfect man, but I think he's been a very fine president, and I think he's moved the country into an era of optimism to a degree, checkered by problems, but I think broad-based optimism about what we can do in the future.
They drew a line around the Oval Office and stopped there.
Haynes Johnson of the Washington Post.
And it's like a mystery story in which the author at the end decides that, well, you won't be able to resolve who done it because you don't have the guts to do it. So you leave it up in the air.
We can build in every precaution known to the world. We can design the best system ever devised by man. But in the end, people are going to have to run it. And we will never be free of human hopes, weaknesses, and enthusiasms.
The president, to the extent that he got a free ride, was based upon a climate in the country that wanted him to succeed, coming after all the presidential failures of the past. Assassination of John Kennedy, the murder of Martin Luther King, the murder of Robert Kennedy, the failure of Richard Nixon, the disaster with Lyndon Johnson and the war and all the pain there, the collective failures of Nixon and all the way down to Jimmy Carter. And I really do believe it's important to put that in the context of where we were. Now, that raises a more troubling question. How does the country get exercised? How does it reach a moral compass about what is right and what is wrong? And where does the level of indignation rise? What does it take? And I think that's an interesting question about our times.
It seems to me what happened in all of this is, in effect, there was a junta within the government of the United States.
Democratic Senator Paul Sarbanes of Maryland addressing former White House Chief of Staff Donald Regan.
I mean, you had Poindexter and North and their associates in effect invoking the authority of the President of the United States, freezing out the Chief of Staff, the Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of State, and pursuing their own policies which the President says if he'd known about them, he would have strongly opposed, and policies which you say that when you learned about them, you reacted with shock and horror.
Shock and horror may well have been your initial reactions to the Iran-contra affair as well, but those aren't very creative emotions, and most of us, since the time we first heard about the hearings, have attempted to put them in another framework, and that's the purpose of this program, to allow the American people to demonstrate the political will to deal with these matters, legislatively or judicially, with the information and the opinions they need to make up their minds. Before a final word from the Congressional Panel's co-chairman, I'd like to tell you that this program was produced and assembled by me, Larry Bensky, with assistance in editing and arranging interviews from Bill Wax, who also produced Pacifica Radio's live gavel-to-gavel coverage of the Iran-contra hearings. Jenna Allison helped with editing tape, Diane James assisted with research, and the program was mixed and recorded by Michael Yoshida at Pacifica Radio Station KPFA in Berkeley, California. This program was funded with a grant from the Pacifica Program Fund and is the property of the Pacifica Foundation. For information regarding purchase of cassette copies, please contact the Pacifica Program Service, 5316 Venice Boulevard, Los Angeles, California, 90019. That's Pacifica Program Service, 5316 Venice Boulevard, Los Angeles, California, 90019. And now for those final words from the man who so often provided such summary orations at the hearings, Co-Chairman Lee Hamilton of Indiana, and our thanks to him and the other people who so generously shared their time with us and made this program possible.
It's a depressing story. It's a sad story. And I think anybody who looks at the lying and the deception and the misleading and the destruction of documents, the important presidential documents, has to be distressed about it. There's another side of that, though. The other side of it is that we were able to find out these things, bring them to the public view, and to discuss them, and I hope to correct them. In other words, they weren't swept under the rug, and that kind of encourages me about the democratic process itself. We didn't do it in a neat, tidy, precise way. It was a little bit messy, I guess, at times, but overall the process is rather refreshing.
What guarantee do we have that some variety of the same thing isn't going on right now, that the Singlaub, Hakim, Secord, perhaps, team is not presently at work in the Philippines or someplace in Africa? How do we know that?
Oh, I can't give any guarantees. I've been burned a few times myself in these investigations over a period of years, and I'm going to be pretty reluctant to give guarantees to anybody. The real answer to that is that there has to be continued vigilance. And that's the only answer I really know. I don't think you can structure the law in such a way that those who would subvert it cannot get around it at times.
You've been listening to Untangling the Web, the Iran-contra Hearings Revisited. I'm Larry Bensky for Pacifica Radio.